Good morning, everyone. I'm Ann Kinseth. I'm the Director of Education here at the Meadows Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to the first in our four-part Luis Martín lecture series in the Humanities. And I'm thrilled to have so many of you joining us in person, and also so pleased to have an audience on Zoom today as well. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Jodi Campbell. She comes to us from Texas Christian University, where she's a professor of European history, specializing in the culture and society of Golden Age Spain. She holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota, and her research includes a book on political ideas in Spanish drama, an edited volume on women in early modern Atlantic port cities, and her most recent book, At the First Table, which deals with the culture of food in early modern Spain. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jodi Campbell to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to see such a good crowd, and thanks to all of you who are joining by Zoom. Especially thanks to Ann Kinseth and Amanda Dotseth for inviting me. Can you all hear me all right? Is there enough volume here? So I'm as a historian of Spain, the Meadows has always been one of my favorite places. And in fact, I moved to Fort Worth to start at TCU 20 years ago. So my time here has kind of coincided with the history of this building that was built for this wonderful collection. So it's an enormous honor to be asked to speak here at this as part of this wonderful collection, especially since I really know nothing about art history. So I'm appreciative of it, but I'm a history historian more than an art historian. And you guys, you have Amanda Dotseth and Adam Jasinski and folks that can do that much better than I. Is there is the volume okay? Is that clear enough? All right, thanks. Thanks for the feedback. So again, you have a wonderful team of art historians here who are good at the art history stuff. What I can contribute is more of a sense of the history. And one of the things that I've been interested in working with early modern Spanish history is the kinds of connections that people build with each other, how people understand their relationships, political relationships, social relationships, what the expectations are that people have of each other. That's the kind of thing I've tried to explore in various ways. And it turns out that studying food is a really good way to get at that, to see how people express their relationships and expectations. So the history of food, historians work with texts mostly, right? But the history of food is a relatively recent thing. It started a few decades ago, kind of in a social sciencey way of looking at agriculture and how many acres of wheat you would need to produce enough bread for a village to survive on, or if every person doing X amount of labor needs an average of X grams of bread a day. It's the algebra problems of survival, right? That people started kind of calculating. But then it didn't take long to go past that and say, so one thing is the calculation of nutrition, but what about the meaning? What did bread mean to people? Who did they share it with? How did they prepare it? How did they do it differently for certain occasions? So we know from our own experiences that food is much more than just calorie input. That we invest a lot more significance in it than that. So think of the kinds of things that we communicate with food. How many of you still try to have family dinners on a regular basis, right? There's been lots of talk about the fracturing of the American family, or the ways that we spend too much time on our phones and not enough talking to each other. Dinner is always the solution to that. If we can find a way to connect, to share a meal with people, connect with each other over food, we're always proposing family dinners as a way to get past those kinds of divisions. The importance of sharing food with the people that we love. In fact, the very word companion, which hopefully will come along with me here. The word companion, the people that we associate with, the root of that word is companions, with bread, the people that you share bread with. Your companions are your with bread people. So that food is at the heart of that, of how we consider companionship, or we talk about breaking bread. So sharing food of all kinds is an important connection. Think of the obvious examples are various kinds of holidays. Do you have recipes that you break out for important holidays? Thanksgivings, Easters, Christmas. In fact, got a haircut a few days ago, and I was chatting with my stylist, and I said, oh, so Easter's coming up. Do you have plans for Easter? And she lit up and she said, oh, I'm making ham, and my husband's doing brisket. I'm going to make deviled eggs. And she listed the whole menu. And I thought, that's Easter. Your celebration of Easter. Her mind, like the whole thing was centered on the food that she's preparing, of course, then the people that would be shared with. So there are Easter traditions, Thanksgiving especially. So think of your Thanksgiving turkey. So do any of you, you're all my friends here, do you have family conflicts over stuffing? Right? My grandma's recipe or your grandma's recipe, it's just stuffing. But I've seen serious marital conflicts come up over stuffing. Exactly. It could be dressing. It could be. I'm a Midwesterner. So I have I put my foot in it right there. So exactly, it's what you call it, how you make it, whose tradition you're representing. So those choices mean identity, regional identity, cultural identity, tradition, whose choices you're passing on, whose memory you're invoking by preparing those things, the right way of doing things. So it's not hard to come up with examples like that of the cultural significance of food. And this is even more, it's easy for us, it's even more significant for the early modern period, which is roughly 1300 to 1800. I'll use it sort of interchangeably with the Renaissance, or in Spain, sometimes we call it the Golden Age, but roughly the Renaissance. Because this is a society that is very invested in different categories of people. And this is always a thing that's harder for modern Americans perhaps to understand, because we're very invested in how we think of ourselves as individuals, right? We create our own choices, we make of ourselves what we want to be. That's an important characteristic of modern culture. But in the Renaissance, in Renaissance Europe, people are very aware of the category that they're in. You're in a certain social status, you have certain kind of social responsibilities, you're in a particular category of person, and that needs to be visible through your dress, through the people that you associate with, through your house, your architecture. All of those things need to communicate the kind of person that you are through like social status, gender, religious identity. All of those things are important, and you need to visually conform to those things. So food turns out to be a very useful, interesting way of looking at those things. So for the sort of larger picture of what I was thinking of for these Martín lectures, if you're wondering how we will spend 4 weeks talking about food, there's lots there. So today, I want to give you sort of that larger map of the kinds of cultural meaning food can have. And then next week, we'll look at social status and competition, the way people try to manipulate identity or carve out kind of a better social space for themselves using food. Food is one of the key mechanisms for that. We will skip the Friday of Easter Passover weekend, and then there'll be 2 more, one on food and religious identity, which is crucial for sort of social performance in early modern Spain in particular. And then the last will be on gifts and rituals, the exchanges of food, rituals that are performed that are centered around food. So lots of different topics that this really lends itself to. So in terms of the broader kind of cultural map or the cultural picture of food, you all remember the food pyramid, right? That we talked about the different categories of food. The Renaissance has its own, not quite a pyramid, but its own kind of structure of values of food. So again, if we start with ourselves, if you think of the kinds of foods that we value or privilege over other kinds, regardless of taste or preference, but if you had a choice, you go out to a nice restaurant, you're treating yourself, if you can choose between steak and chicken, which is more valuable, more admired? We're Texas, right? I'm from Nebraska. We appreciate the importance of good beef. Steak is just, again, whether or not you like it more, we think of steak as a higher ranking, a more privileged kind of food. That's actually quite the opposite in the case of early modern Spain. So early modern Europe in general has a very different kind of cultural framework. So the image that I'm using here is the whole universe, not just the food pyramid, but how Europeans understand their place in the universe. And this is based on Aristotle, where The universe is, everything in the universe is composed of some balance of the four elements, right? Earth and air and water and fire. All living things, all material things are composed of some balance of those elements. And so they have, each of those has its natural place. That Earth is at the center, so this is expanding that out to the whole cosmos. Earth is at the center, and then water, and then air, and then fire. And those all have relative value in the sense that the farther you go out, the better they are, the more valuable, the more precious, the more heavenly. So over time, you sort of map this onto a Christian cosmography. You have God in the heavens. So the closer we are to Earth, the more base and sinful, but the farther you go to the heavens, the more perfect or perfectible things can be. So the universe is imagined that way, with not just the four elements, but the relative value of those elements. And in this case, you have the angels, and the God is the prime mover and the farthest outside circle of these things. So as we add earthly things into this, not just the cosmos, but how we measure the things around us, food gets worked into this map. In the simplest way, just in the sense that the basest things are closest to the ground and the most valued things are higher up. So if we map animals onto that, anything with wings is the best. The higher up something is, especially game birds, so poultry, chicken, partridge, pheasant, duck, anything that flies, anything that's higher up is valued more. It's a more treasured food for elites. And then the farther down you go, mutton, beef. So of the various meats, beef actually ranks the lowest. So something that is of greater cultural value for us is actually less, especially in Spain. Spain doesn't have very well-developed cattle. Think of beef as food. So beef ranks rather low, well below chicken in this rank of cultural value. And then fish being lower than that. So all of these, again, your choices aren't necessarily made by personal taste. They're made by the kind of thing that corresponds to your place in the social hierarchy. So this works for animals, vegetables, and plants. And all of these things map onto the social hierarchy of humans. Whenever you have any, that's easy to see in any organization, like for example, a monastery, the abbot would be served chicken and the novices would be served beef. So you are fed according to your rank. There are records, supply records for the army of Navarre in the early 1400s that do the same thing: chicken for the officers, mutton for the soldiers. So any kind of ranking of people is going to have a ranking of food that goes along with that. So this is mapped out, it's explained in recipe books, and it's something that people understand, but it is mapped out in treatises, in advice books, in recipe books. It's echoed in lots of different ways. Explanations and sort of dietary treatises about the kinds of foods that are most appropriate to each person, partly by that hierarchy, also by things, anything that's low. Vegetables are all kind of low things anyway, but there you can divide them by things that are underground, of course, are best for peasant food, and things that are higher up are better for elites. So radishes and cheese are nourishing and solid, and they're the best food for students. And so the same thing maps onto fruits and vegetables. The higher up something grows, the more prized it is. So you get things like cherries, orchard fruits. Anything on a tree is higher up and therefore more valued. Garlic and turnips, of course, ground things are more peasant food. So these are explained in lots of different kinds of texts. It also shows up in stories. There are all kinds of folk tales. You're probably familiar with the various kinds of stories about babies who are switched at birth, or a prince and a peasant who are switched somehow, or in some cases, there are stories of princes. There might be a prophecy that he'll be killed, and so he is hidden and raised as a peasant. Whenever those things happen, whenever someone's identity is switched or hidden in some way, food is always the way you find out. Because the prince that is being raised as a peasant can't eat peasant food. He doesn't do well on garlic and turnips. Or the peasant that's being raised in the castle can't eat the eatings. He chokes on the fine foods. So there's some sense that there's an actual physical difference, that elites are physically different and should be eating different kinds of foods that are appropriate to them. So again, this idea gets expressed in lots of different kinds of ways. There's a sense that heritage kind of marks your physical components. So everyone should eat things that correspond to their heritage, their family nature, their titles of nobility, and to some degree to status in ways that can change. So status is not terribly flexible, but there are cases when someone could receive a privileged position, and in that case, his diet would change to go along with that. There's a wonderful case of a notary in Florence who received a gift of partridges, so a great elite kind of gift from a friend. And this notary had been on the city council in Florence, the Signori, which is a prestigious sort of appointment. But it's a period of several months or a year. He rotated off. So he responded to the friend and he said, you got it wrong. Like the partridges would have made sense when I was on the city council, but I'm not anymore. So it was the gift, but I can't eat partridge now. I'm not that kind of person. So, month by month, your position can change, but the things that you should be eating will change along with that. So game birds, especially partridges, thrushes, hens, those are particularly the most valued. Chickens are in this odd position of being that they're sort of in between because they're things with wings, and therefore they are more valued. But they're also really accessible, much more than game birds are. You don't need permission to go hunting them. Anyone can raise chickens. They're not hard. My neighbors have chickens in their backyard. So they're accessible, and yet they're kind of prized at the same time because they're higher up in the status. So they can actually take on kind of a way of being currency. They have value that can be exchanged for other things. So they take on the symbolic value in Spain of representing currency, or sometimes being exchanged along with contracts. You can have like land rental contracts that include either the value of things expressed in chickens, or there's a chicken exchange rate that can be calculated, or sometimes for larger amounts, simply a pair of hens that would be exchanged along with a payment of some kind. So this is another thing that shows up. In fact, this is a case from Seville, but there are whole collections of record books in the Cathedral of Toledo where the account books are simply labeled hens, because that's what they're keeping track of. Whenever anyone has a rental contract, it is measured in numbers of hens. So this is one particular contract that has an agreement to pay 10 chickens for this sort of annual rent of land. So chickens are this sort of position of being valued food, but also easily accessible, and therefore kind of an odd position as currency. So again, people generally understand this. It's mapped out in lots of ways. It's culturally, it shows up in lots of different kinds of documents. And that was one of the fun things about this project. When I started researching, I thought, we all know, we can think of the ways that food has cultural meaning, but will that show up in the documents? Did people talk about it? Did they write it down? I wonder if I could find some things. And so I went to Spain and dug through archives, and it's everywhere. All kinds, again, fiction, recipe books, account books. People talk about food all the time. So it was much easier than I had feared to actually get into these kinds of things if you're trying to measure how do people feel about chickens, different kinds of food. So it's easy to find references to this, that people are talking about this kind of hierarchy. It's not completely rigid. It's understood, but there are plenty of exceptions to it that you can find. It can be overridden by custom or other factors. For example, things like strawberries. If you're thinking of the realm of fruit, strawberries grow low to the ground. So they should, by the Aristotelian logic, they should not be that valuable, but they're strawberries. People like strawberries. There are lots of references to them in Shakespeare, especially as part of noble gardens. So they are clearly associated with elites. So they break that rule a little bit just because strawberries are good. But they do have kind of an association with positive things. They show up, there are lots of references to cultivating them in the gardens of royal and noble households. So they can be an exception. Or things that are unusual. Pineapples are a new fruit to Europeans. Right? They're cultivated in the New World. So again, they're ground level fruit, but they're exotic, they're new, they're hard to acquire, they don't grow well in Europe. So this is an example of a pineapple being presented to King Charles II of England. May have been an import, or there's some guessing that this may have been the first pineapple cultivated in England. They don't take very well to England. But the fact that this is being presented as a gift to the king because it's exotic, because it's unusual. So those kinds of factors can overrule the height rule. So things can take on cultural significance in a way that might outrank the natural significance, if that makes sense. They're kind of competing registers for creating meaning here. And then sometimes, not often and beyond all of these other factors, but sometimes personal choice can really factor in. If you happen to like something, that's simply that usually whatever kind of person you are meant to eat things that fit your person. But elites can play with that a little bit. Sometimes there are cases where you see people trying to work in personal choice beyond these kinds of factors. So for example, in providing things like managing the slaughter of animals, there's an internal hierarchy to the animal, and in the same way there is a hierarchy between animals, in that things like tripe, intestines, organ meats, blood, those are things that are less valued within any given animal. So there are lots of regulations that try to preserve those things for the poor, to make sure that poor people have access to protein. So for example, in cities like Madrid, there are municipal regulations around slaughterhouses that mandate the reservation of those to make sure that they're sold to the poor first, that they have the chance to buy awful organ meats before anyone else has a chance at them. But they also appear pretty frequently in the kitchen accounts of noble households. That's not supposed to be noble food, but they buy them, and they partly because perhaps personal taste, perhaps because on days of fasting, those meats were not quite as prohibited, that they occupy kind of a gray area between flesh and not flesh. But perhaps many cases where it seems to be a case of personal taste. So for example, the city officials in Madrid have the responsibility of distributing these products of slaughterhouses, and they receive frequent petitions from noble households. And can we have permission to buy these things for ourselves? So it leaves a paper trail. That means that nobles are trying to get a hold of things that they should not really be eating. But in general, there is kind of this common understanding of that social hierarchy of food. So beyond the meaning of the food itself, that everyone understands all of these foods to carry a kind of cultural value, there's also eating as social performance, right? Who you eat with, who you serve, who you invite to your house. There's a lot of eating happens in public or visible ways. And of course, Renaissance people love banquets and the offering of food, the sharing of food. So it's a significant factor in how you represent yourself, how you display your connections with other people and your family. So in these cases, food can be generosity and loyalty. It can cement relationships, especially among elites. So this happens quite often with the court. Before the 1560s, Spain did not have a fixed court. The kings and queens would travel around. There's not a palace. There's not a fixed place where they would hold court. So they travel. And this is also facilitated by the fact Spain had been fairly recently established from a series of smaller kingdoms, not terribly well unified. So just in terms of governance, it makes sense for a king to be itinerant, to travel around to the different territories. But that means that part of the obligation of the nobility is to feed and house the monarch as he's traveling. Since there isn't a fixed court, Charles V shows up in town, and you're supposed to take him on in his retinue and then feed everyone. So that happens in very public kinds of ways. For example, there's an account of the Archbishop of Toledo in the early 15th century, who built a solid reputation as a loyal supporter of the Crown of Castile, among other things because of the sumptuous dishes that he offered to John II of Castile. He would provide these banquets of well-prepared food, and people noticed that. That was a sign of his loyalty, the sign of his role as a good servant. Which is particularly noticeable because not long after that, his nephew, the noble Don Alvaro de Luna, also had the chance to host the king and provided a very poor table, in spite of the fact that he was known to have some of the best cooks in the country. So again, this was noted, this was commented on, and in fact, not long after that, Don Alvaro was arrested for intrigues against the king and was executed in 1453. Not directly because of the food, probably, but it was a sign, right? It was understood that he was not very reliable because he wasn't feeding the king quite in the way that he should have. So you weren't likely to be executed just for a bad table, but that kind of expression of loyalty can go the other direction as well. The kind of support kings can give their nobles. Henry IV of Castile had regular banquets for elite guests and his nobles. And when his treasurer complained about the expense and said, you're ruining the court just by feeding people, by hosting these banquets. And Henry's response was, I feed them so they will serve me. So that there's a clear expectation. I provide for them. If they partake of that table, then they need to be loyal to me. So the descriptions of these kinds of banquets are extraordinary. I mean, I've always wondered how reliable the documentation is, but the lists are always pretty spectacular. So here is one part from the account books of the investiture of the Archbishop of York that includes the peacocks and the pheasants and the egrets and the porpoises and the quail. Really just extraordinary quantities of extraordinary things. It's kind of shocking in terms of numbers and things, but this is not unusual. The kinds of things that get supplied, because it's a performance. The food can be a display of power, it's a display of loyalty, it's a display of hierarchy, it's a display of connection. So those are some of the ways food can get used in these contexts. It can also be charity, which again is a kind of relationship. One common thing at funerals was to have sort of two levels. You would have at really any significant funeral, the family would provide out of the estate, the family would provide a meal for family and guests, but then a substantial donation of bread for the poor as well, usually at the burial site, to provide bread and wine for the poor at the burial. And then in many cases that would be repeated yearly on the anniversary of the donor's death. So again, this is a thing that shows up. It's a common stipulation in people's wills that out of their estate, they would set aside a substantial amount of money for provision of bread for the poor. And not just charitable donations, but bread that is in the form of food, which is also, especially at the moment of a funeral, it's a good public exercise of Christian charity, right? It's meant to be seen. And funerals are always, especially in this context, kind of a tension between ostentation, but wanting to be humble. It's a moment when you want to display your Christian humility and obedience and charity. So providing bread for the poor is a good way to balance out whatever ostentation you want to have around the family. So as an example, there was a Madrid city councilman in the 16th century who in his will requested a simple burial because he said, all the pomp and fuss in the world is of no use to the soul. But he left 4,000 maravedis for bread for the poor. And then that quantity at that time would have purchased about 800 pounds of bread. So it's a significant donation. And again, something that would be visible to the city. So again, there's a performative aspect to this kind of generosity. And these kinds of donations were really quite common. Again, that it's common to find these stipulations in wills. Noble households and the royal court would do frequent kinds of offerings of food for the poor. The Archbishop of Seville in the 17th century, every Thursday, would host a gathering of 12 beggars to provide them a meal in his own household. And similarly, every year on Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Easter, the Spanish royal family would welcome 13 beggars into the royal palace and wash their feet and prepare them a meal. So these things, they're interesting choices because it's not really a tactic to alleviate poverty, right? It's much more a symbolic gesture of a limited number of people, but in a performative and visual kind of way. Here I am as a noble household, or here I am as the crown, providing for the poor in these very, very visible ways. So this is food as virtue, food as Christian charity, food as providing for those who are needy. Or, of course, if one embraces excess, this can go the other direction. Food can be gluttony and vice, which, of course, is the role that it plays in Murillo's story of the prodigal son. So, of course, and hopefully you've all visited this upstairs. So the parable is, as you know, about the son who here asks for his share of the inheritance. so he can go off on his own. And then he spends everything and is ruined and returns home full of apology and is welcomed back. So here he is requesting his share so that he can go out. The parable itself only says that the son squanders his wealth in dissolute living. There's nothing particularly specific about that. In artistic representations, it can be drink, it can be prostitution, it can be not terribly clear at all, any kind of excess. But in the 17th century, it gets represented fairly often as food or feasting, and especially in this representation of Murillo, that the moment that tells you the story that here he is wasting his inheritance in dissolute living is centered on food and the people he's sharing it with. So again, this comes from the Gospel of Luke, but it's clearly set in Murillo's Seville, and the architecture and the clothes, and as Aoife Brady pointed out in her talk a few weeks ago, the tableware corresponds to recognizably civilian metalwork. So this is a context that the populace of early modern Seville would have recognized. It's familiar territory. The food is part of that familiar territory. The plates themselves and the salt cellar are recognizably civilian metalware. So there's the setting. There's also the food that is being served, some kind of savory pastry in the center, probably things with wings, a little chunk of bread in the center, but probably game birds of some kind. And notice also the people that he's sharing with, that his with bread people, right, his companions, are courtesans. So it's not just the food itself that is elite and excessive and gluttonous kinds of food, but the people that he's establishing connections with. No longer his family, but courtesans and musicians that represent the sort of wastefulness and sin. And also, as in terms of how an early modern audience would have recognized this, another thing that Aoife Brady points out is the number of parallels between Murillo's representation and how the story is portrayed on the Spanish stage. Because this is the same time frame as Shakespeare. Theater is just as popular, if not more so, in Spain than it is in England. Enormously popular, that familiar stories are played out on stage. Theaters are constantly packed with traveling theatrical companies. And this is one of the stories that is played out on stage as well as in art. With one example, an Auto Sacramental, a short religious play, kind of like a sermon on stage by Lope de Vega, who is one of the best-known Spanish playwrights. One of his works is this Auto about the Prodigal Son, that includes not just the prodigal son, but characters that represent gambling and lasciviousness and gluttony. And there's an extensive description of the food, which again isn't part of the parable. But when Lope is describing the setting, they're talking, oh, we're waiting for the food to be brought in. Oh, the food's being brought in. It's wonderful. Here are the musicians singing about the food. The excess is very much centered on the foods that are being brought into this celebration by the prodigal son. And the description of the things that are being offered is almost entirely game birds. It's thrush, partridge, pheasants, also capon and hare. All of them have that association, not just elite foods, but delicacies, things the prodigal son perhaps should not be spending his inheritance on. So the particular food choices would resonate with this audience, all the riches and delicacies that he is eating in this theatrical version. And I think it's interesting as well that all of the other key points in the story, in the parable itself, they're kind of underlined with food references. So when the prodigal son is run out of town because he's spent everything, and he's thrown out, he's out of money, he takes work as a swineherd, and as he falls into abject poverty, the description is as he's taking care of the pigs, he envies the pigs their dinner. He's looking at their trough, which again is a clear symbol of poverty. But for an early modern audience, if you eat animal food, you are a beast. If he is actually coveting their food, that's a symbol of what he has become, or what he's on the verge of becoming. When in the parable does say he would gladly have eaten the pods that the swine were eating. So that would, again, for an early modern audience, that converts him into a pig himself. And in fact, early modern conduct books make those kinds of references a lot when they talk about restraint and they talk about proper behavior at table. They will always phrase it in those terms. Don't be a beast. Don't be an animal. Show that you are human by using your rationality and your self-restraint to not become a beast. So that the way one eats is that fine line between humanness and beastliness. And then, of course, when he returns, he is welcomed by his father, not just welcomed back into the family and forgiven, but welcomed with the promise of killing the fatted calf as a feast. So it's a small part of this representation, but the fatted calf is being led in the background. And in the later part of the parable that Murillo doesn't fully address, but it's part of the story, the other brother's complaint is precisely that you never slaughtered a goat for me. But this brother goes off gallivanting around, wastes everything, and for him, you have a feast. So that the resentment part of that story also kind of centers on the father's appreciation, measured in the feasts that he provides or doesn't for each son. So it's curious to think that feasting, at least in the Murillo version, is at the center of both the conflict and the resolution of the story. The wastefulness is in feasting, but then the reconciliation with the family is feasting as well. So early modern Spanish audiences were prepared for the association of the wastefulness, the dissolute living of the prodigal son, with gluttony, in particular, the excess of food, especially in a city like Seville, where, because of connections to the New World, fortunes could rise and fall dramatically with the establishment of New World colonies and trade. And in fact, the plagues that struck Seville in the years just before Murillo painted the cycle were often interpreted as a kind of divine punishment, of punishment for sin and excess. And in the 17th century overall, there is real concern about extravagance, about excess, and especially centered on wastefulness with food, as associated with both sin and economic ruin. Right? It's morally dangerous, it's economically dangerous. So imagine the examples that I've given already, the banquets with the 1,000 barrels of wine and the pheasants and the swans and the peacocks. There's this visual element of public display and providing food. That becomes more and more competitive. And that's one of the themes I'll talk about next week, the competition for status through banquets and through tableware and table manners and those kinds of things. So that competition kind of peaks in the late 1500s and early 1600s. At the same time that the economy starts to slide. There are increasing challenges in maintaining Spain's overseas empire. The empire really reaches its height around the 1580s in terms of global prestige, in terms of military power. Things start to slide after that. And Spaniards are very aware. There's much discussion. What have we done wrong? How have we sinned? How have we mismanaged, like the prodigal son? How did we waste this inheritance that we have? So the Spaniards are very aware of not being quite in the global position that they were in decades earlier, and they're looking for explanations. So there are lots of official treatises, government debates about wastefulness and extravagance, that nobles and elites are spending too much in displays, especially displays of status, clothing, and food. Others are spending too much trying to look like elites, the social competition. And gluttony sort of becomes the best hook to hang that on. To hang those criticisms on. Like we're all being collectively gluttonous. We are consuming too much and not really generating anything constructive. So there are lots of, again, treatises, discussions. Spaniards are talking about this in lots of kinds of ways. So this is a book, The Mirror of the Christian Prince. It's an advice book to princes, right? It's about good governance. It's essentially about political practice. But it has lots and lots of examples about food. That food is a symbol, the way that you manage food is a symbol of good governance. So gluttony and wastefulness are not, of course, examples of good governance. So if you're eating and drinking delicacies and giving yourself to carnal delights, you will not enjoy spiritual glory, or leading to doing things that are offensive to God and against good custom. And an entire chapter on the temperance that princes should maintain in regard to their food. Again, that princes were expected to have kind of a model of restraint, of willpower, restraint, which meant good governance. So that the way one consumes food ties very much into politics. And notice that the dangers of gluttony, if this is presented as a problem, it's not the physical danger of excess. or not the danger to the individual that people warn about, very, very, very rarely. But the concern here is that gluttony is dangerous to the collective. It's dangerous to society. It's dangerous to the whole community, because indulging one's appetite was seen to be kind of a threat to common sense. Again, the threat to good governance, something that could lead to corruption and the broader ruin of the country. So if you think of the prodigal son as not just a religious metaphor about redemption, but perhaps a metaphor for a whole social group and people who are indulging their desires and irrationally wasting their inheritance. That's how this may have come across, I think very likely would have come across to a Spanish audience that was accustomed to those messages about food and excess and wastefulness and poor government and perhaps the decline of an entire empire. And similarly, I mentioned Lope de Vega earlier, early modern theater, lots of stories about kings, lots of stories about government. I see theater as a really interesting laboratory for experimenting with political ideas. You know, what would happen if a king behaved badly? What would happen if people splurged their inheritance? That you can, without directly criticizing anyone, you can play with those kinds of things on stage. And gluttony shows up in all of these stories as an example of poor government or danger to society. Again, it affects one's judgment. It provides a bad example. Princes ought to be models of restraint and self-control. Governing a country means governing oneself, which means controlling one's appetite. And in fact, there are several treatises that identify the dangers, not just of excess and corruption, but of loosening one's tongue, spilling too many secrets at extravagant court banquets. Like, you lure people in with extravagant court banquets, and people suggest, well, there could be spies. Like, these could be actually engineered to get information out of people so that guests will overindulge and perhaps spill some secrets. And there's one diplomat in the Spanish court that comments that many voluntarily profess more at table than they would confess under torture. So you feed people well enough and give them plenty to drink, and all the things come out. So package all of those things into the prodigal son. The feasting, this moment that represents his error, is more than just food. It's the wasted inheritance. It's the immoral behavior. It's the potential collapse of all of society by these kinds of choices. So that, for this week, I'll pause with that. That's sort of an overview of food in all of these different ways, as loyalty, as generosity, as connection, as charity, and possibly as glutton and sin and extravagance. Which is why, even though it's almost lunchtime, we will not conclude this talk with an extravagant banquet. I wouldn't want to lead you all into ruin. So thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have time for some questions. For those of you in the auditorium, Olivia, who's up there, will be passing the microphone around. It's important for you to ask your question into the microphone so people on Zoom can hear the question being asked. For those of you on Zoom, if you can put your questions in the chat box and I will share them with the speaker.
Is this a situation that is mostly shown in Spain? I do a lot of food history, and you don't see this sort of attitude in Italian food or French or English, where they're talking about being very a bad thing to.
Oh, it might be. It's interesting that early modern food history, there are some pretty common patterns across most of Europe. The concerns in Spain might, if you're thinking of that particular negative association, that might be more particular given there's a larger argument about the decline of Spain. There is at least a very powerful perception of the decline of Spain in the 1620s and 30s and 40s.
I think it's also a part of the general Spanish mentality.
It could well be.
It's you don't see this in English food history.
That's true. That's a really interesting element because many of the other elements are the competition, the banquets, the development of table manners. Those are all really similar patterns. But that concern about wastefulness and decline that would be logical for it to be a Spanish thing.
Versus Protestant, I think, is part of it.
Also, yeah. Thank you.
We have a question from Zoom. So someone is wondering about noble households petitioning to be able to purchase low status foods. Do you have a sense of whether they intended to eat the foods themselves or serve them to their servants?
That's a good question. I think that I remember a couple of references where they did want to consume it themselves. And they would generally, the servants would have eaten leftovers. Servants were often paid in rations of food. So that could have been just from the regular household accounts, but they're so specifically, at least in the municipal legislation, they're so specifically reserved for the poor who have no other recourses. That I think the examples I'm half remembering, I think are very specific about the nobles wanting them for their own table.
You may have made a comment, I may have missed it. How about foods that be given at weddings? Is a feasting kind of a situation?
Absolutely. In fact, that sort of ties into the excess and the wastefulness in that weddings, there's such a powerful expectation for providing food that the success of the families that are being joined is really measured in how well they feed people. This is an Italian example, but there's an Italian merchant who keeps a diary, and he comments on that there's a wedding where there wasn't enough food for everyone, and that's social disaster. There's ruin for this. It's embarrassment. It ruins the reputation. So the expectations are high, and in the case of Spain and many other countries as well, there come to be legal restrictions, precisely because, again, the competition becomes so high that there are restrictions put in place, sumptuary laws that say you can only serve 6 courses, no more than 50 people. No more than 3 days of feasting. They'll start putting some restrictions around that to keep it from being too excessive. But weddings are some of the best opportunities for that. Yeah, I'll tie some examples into that for next week.
Share another from Zoom. So could you address where vegetables and fruits fall on the medieval food hierarchy?
They follow mostly the same kind of pattern in that the higher up they are, and it's harder for vegetables because they're all kind of ground level. So the only real distinction is sort of above ground and below ground, that onions and turnips and garlic are lower things, and then leeks and spinach are better. And it's curious because there's also sort of the medical understandings of these things that don't necessarily match, because in the Galenic sort of medical ideas, fruit is actually not great. Food is cold and wet. It's considered to be unhealthy. And yet noble tables provide bountiful amounts of fruit. They enjoy it. So these don't always match up very clearly, but usually it's just the verticality of it that determines things. And one way of, rescuing things, if you have any kind of vegetable that you would like to serve, regardless of how valued it is, add things like sugar and cinnamon. Because sugar is fairly rare, fairly valuable. Cinnamon, the whole pumpkin spice range is becoming available to Europeans at this point. And I have found any number of recipes for things like stuffed onions baked with a sugar cinnamon sauce. Because but by adding these valuable seasonings, that makes it better. So even though onions would not be a very prized thing, anything you can add cinnamon sugar to. I have not tried that recipe. It scares me a little bit, but there are lots of things with cinnamon sugar. So that's another way to kind of counteract those expectations.
I was just wondering about the religious aspect because, I mean, man doth not live by bread alone. Mm-hmm. And as I recall, gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins. Mm-hmm. And at this time, which is a fairly lengthy time, were preachers and the elite of the church preaching against the gluttony? Did you go to mass on Sunday and hear you did? Because you were talking about treatises and philosophy and illustrations.
Sermons.
Could you address that a bit?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sermons, especially, in fact, gluttony is not only one of the mortal sins, but it's considered kind of the gateway to the rest. It's indulging the appetites leads into the other sins. So it's that's the thing that probably shows up in sermons the most, is that gluttony is sort of the easiest of the temptations to fall into that then leads you into worse things. So the same kinds of concerns show up. And then with the elements of the Reformation, and Spain, of course, remains Catholic and very, very determinedly Catholic, and food becomes an integral part of that, fasting as well. There are all sorts of food rules about fasting. There's a great deal of concern about people who are Spaniards who are maintaining secret Jewish or Muslim practices, which can be most easily identified through their food habits. That's a whole separate talk. Like that's worth digging into on its own. So there will be more.
Yes, I really enjoyed the way you tied it to the exhibit that we currently have in the museum. I think you also mentioned that there was the plague at the time in Seville that caused almost a little bit of sobering for the crowd because of the number of deaths and so on. And I wonder if Murillo was, through the church, a message of admonition, if you will, to the civilian people, because they had lived, like you mentioned, a life of really debauchery. And all of a sudden, here it is the stop sign. So could you comment on that? Is that a valid assessment on my part?
It makes sense to me. And that's where I'm not really an art historian, but that makes perfect sense. That it's a story of repentance. And that's another common thing in sermons. If we are being gluttonous, how do we then recover from that? How do we control ourselves? How do we repent? How do we reintegrate into a wholesome, healthy society? So I think that's clearly part of. So it's the message not just of individual repentance, but I think of collective social repentance. That was something. And you're right. The plague in Seville was utterly devastating. Tens of thousands died. And so it's something that he experienced. In fact, his children, if I recall. So it's something that's very immediate and very personal, and something, again, there's this sort of collective questioning in Spanish society about what have we done wrong and how can we atone for it. So I think that very much feeds into what these paintings are trying to do.
Could you comment on the appearance of the pomegranate on the Spanish national coat of arms, the monarch's insignia?
Yes, actually, not very much. But the pomegranate is added with the conquest of Granada, which is the last Muslim kingdom that falls to Spain in 1492. And Granada in Spanish is pomegranate. So it's the symbol of the city. So not just a fruit, but it's Granada is Granada. So as the kings of Castile, first Castile and Aragon, incorporate that into their territory, it's also added in the center of the coat of arms. So it's the city itself. I'm not sure if it has more symbolic resonance than that.
We have, I think, one final question. This one's coming from Zoom, and this might be something you address later in the lecture series, but could you comment at all about the popularity of still life images of food, such as the Sanchez Cotan that's up in the Meadows Museum galleries?
Yes, I don't know as much about still lifes, but I do want to comment on the Sanchez Cotan because it's so interesting, precisely because in that food hierarchy, and the Sanchez Cotan is what? Cabbage, melon, cucumber, and quince. Those are not the cabbage, and that argument of the hierarchy. These are not delicacies. They're not prized things. And those of you who listen to Michael Brown's lecture, he comments that they are things that come out of Spain's Muslim history. That those are all products that were incorporated into Spanish cuisine through its Muslim past. Would people have remembered that in the 1700s and 1600s? I'm not sure. So I would go either way, that it's either an intentional incorporation of those things into a Catholic image, because it is a very, that the painter himself is in a very religious context, and it's framed in kind of a religious way. So it could be like, here is this Catholic framework that these things are being pulled into, or it could be that they're visually interesting. Right, that the melon and the cabbage are for an artist interesting things to play with. I don't know which way to go with that, but there's certainly a possibility of recognizing, because the symbolism of those things is not on their own. They're not prized things. They're visually attractive, but I will play with that a little bit more in some of the later talks.
Well, thank you.